Picture this. It's mid-morning, somewhere in ancient Africa around 200,000 years ago, and a teenage boy is gnawing on a strip of dried meat while walking because that's breakfast, lunch, and basically every meal he's had in the last 3 days rolled into one continuous ongoing snack. There's no table. There's no set time anyone agreed to eat. There's no concept of breakfast is the most important meal of the day, mostly because there's no concept of breakfast at all. Food shows up when food shows up, gets eaten when it's available, and the whole group just sort of grazes through the day in whatever rhythm the environment happens to allow. Meanwhile, 3 days earlier, after a successful hunt brought down a large animal, that same kid ate more meat in a single sitting than he'd probably eat in an entire week during a leaner stretch, gorging himself because nobody knew when the next big meal was coming, and a full stomach today was worth more than a polite, paced-out dinner schedule. So here's the question. This video exists to chase down properly. How many meals did ancient humans actually eat in a day? Were they locked into some kind of disciplined 3 meals a day structure the way modern culture loves to assume is the natural, correct way humans are supposed to eat? Or was ancient eating a complete free-for-all, governed by nothing but hunger, opportunity, and whatever happened to be lying around? Stick around, because the answer is going to mess with a lot of assumptions you didn't even realize you were carrying about what a normal eating schedule actually looks like. And it might make you reconsider whether your own daily 3-meal routine is some deep biological default or just a surprisingly recent cultural invention. Let's start by tearing down the biggest assumption hiding underneath this whole question, because it's doing a lot of quiet damage to how people think about this topic. Modern society treats 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, as some kind of natural, almost biologically mandated structure, the correct way human bodies are supposed to be fed. It is not natural in that sense at all. It's a relatively recent cultural convention shaped heavily by agricultural schedules, industrial work hours, and frankly a lot of arbitrary historical habit that solidified over time into something that just feels obvious and inevitable now. Ancient humans had absolutely no concept of a fixed meal schedule, because fixed meal schedules require something ancient humans simply didn't have: a reliable, predictable, evenly distributed food supply that shows up at consistent intervals regardless of season, weather, or luck. Let's talk about what actually determined when and how much ancient humans ate, because it boils down to a few brutally simple, practical factors rather than any kind of intentional schedule. Food availability, food perishability, and physical activity demands were the real drivers here, not some internal cultural rulebook saying you must eat at these specific times. When food was scarce, ancient humans ate less often and ate smaller amounts because there simply wasn't more available to consume. When food was abundant, particularly following a successful hunt or during a season of plentiful foraging, ancient humans almost certainly ate considerably more often, partly because the food was right there, and partly because perishable food needed to be consumed relatively quickly before it spoiled, especially in a world without refrigeration or reliable long-term preservation for every type of food. This brings us to one of the most genuinely important concepts for understanding ancient eating patterns: the feast and famine cycle. Something we've actually touched on in previous videos regarding body fat and weight fluctuation, but it deserves direct, focused attention here, specifically regarding meal frequency. Following a successful large game hunt, an event that might happen irregularly, sometimes with long gaps in between, ancient humans likely entered a period of genuinely intense, frequent eating, consuming large quantities of fresh meat and fat repeatedly throughout the day for as long as that meat remained edible, which, depending on preservation methods and climate, might only be a matter of days before spoilage became a serious concern. During this kind of feast period, an ancient human might genuinely eat what looks, by modern standards, like 5, 6, or more separate eating episodes throughout a single day. Not because they were following some intentional meal plan, but because there was abundant, perishable food that needed eating and bodies that, frankly, evolved to take full advantage of abundance whenever it actually showed up. Then, inevitably, that abundance would run out, and the group would transition back into a leaner stretch, foraging for whatever smaller, less calorically dense food was available, supplementing with dried or preserved food from the previous hunt if any remained, and eating considerably less often, sometimes going through stretches with genuinely long gaps between substantial meals, possibly even full days with minimal food intake during particularly difficult periods. This means the honest, accurate answer to how many meals did ancient humans eat isn't a single fixed number at all. It's a number that swung dramatically depending on circumstances. Sometimes multiple substantial eating episodes crammed into a single abundant day, sometimes uncomfortably long stretches with barely anything at all, and everything in between depending on season, luck, and location. Let's talk specifically about grazing and snacking, because this represents a huge, often overlooked piece of ancient eating patterns that doesn't fit neatly into the meal framework at all. A massive proportion of ancient human caloric intake almost certainly came from continuous low-level foraging throughout the day. Nuts, berries, roots, insects, small bits of food encountered and consumed more or less immediately while moving through the environment, rather than carried back to camp and eaten as part of any organized sit-down meal. This kind of opportunistic snacking, happening more or less continuously throughout active daylight hours, means the entire concept of counting meals in the modern sense doesn't really map cleanly onto ancient eating behavior at all. An ancient forager might genuinely eat small amounts of food dozens of times throughout a single day, technically interspersed with one or two larger, more substantial eating episodes back at camp, which makes the whole question of how many meals almost a bit of a category error when applied to a lifestyle built around continuous, opportunistic eating rather than discrete, scheduled meal events. Now, this doesn't mean ancient humans never had anything resembling a more substantial shared meal experience either, and it's worth talking directly about when and why those more organized eating events likely happened. Evening meals, eaten together around a fire after the day's hunting and gathering activities wound down, almost certainly represented one of the more consistent, recognizable meal patterns in ancient human life for genuinely practical reasons beyond just hunger. We've discussed in earlier videos how crucial firelit evening gatherings were for social bonding, storytelling, and group cohesion. A shared evening meal, eaten together around that same fire, likely served double duty as both nutritional necessity and important social ritual, bringing the entire group together at the end of an active day to share whatever food had been gathered, hunted, or preserved, while also reinforcing exactly the kind of social bonds that made ancient group survival possible in the first place. This evening meal pattern, more than any strict morning or midday meal structure, likely represents the closest thing ancient humans actually had to a consistent, recognizable daily meal ritual. Let's talk about morning eating specifically, because there's a genuinely interesting biological and practical argument for why ancient humans probably didn't eat much, if anything, immediately upon waking, in pretty stark contrast to modern breakfast culture's insistence that morning eating is essential and non-negotiable. Hunting and foraging, the core activities that actually produced food, generally needed to happen before food was available to eat, which creates an obvious, practical sequencing problem for anything resembling a hearty modern breakfast. An ancient human waking up at dawn almost certainly didn't have a meal ready and waiting. They had to go find or catch that meal first, which meant a significant portion of the early day likely passed with minimal or no food intake at all, especially following a leaner previous day with little surplus left over from the night before. Some researchers studying human metabolic adaptation have specifically pointed to this pattern as evidence that humans may be reasonably well adapted to functioning effectively on relatively low food intake during morning hours, drawing on overnight fat and glycogen stores for energy. Precisely because that pattern likely characterized an enormous stretch of our evolutionary history. This connects to a genuinely interesting modern conversation around intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating. Something that's become trendy in certain wellness and fitness circles in recent years, often marketed with direct, explicit appeals to how ancient humans probably ate this way too. There's real, legitimate evolutionary logic supporting at least part of that claim, given everything we've just discussed about ancient humans likely going extended periods, particularly in the morning, without substantial food intake before successfully hunting or foraging enough to actually eat. But it's worth being careful here and not oversimplifying this into a tidy, marketable lifestyle prescription, because ancient eating patterns weren't a deliberate, intentional fasting protocol chosen for health optimization. They were simply the unavoidable, practical consequence of food not being reliably available on demand. Ancient humans weren't disciplined intermittent fasters following a structured eating window by choice. They were people eating whenever food happened to actually be there, which sometimes looked like extended gaps between meals purely by circumstance, not by deliberate health strategy. Let's bring in some genuinely useful comparative evidence here, because we don't have to rely purely on theoretical reasoning about deep ancient eating patterns. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, which give us a meaningful, if imperfect, living window into eating patterns that likely echo ancient human behavior fairly closely, have documented eating patterns that align remarkably well with everything we've covered so far. Researchers studying various hunter-gatherer groups have noted eating patterns that don't follow any fixed schedule at all, with food consumption clustered around actual food availability rather than any predetermined time structure. Frequent smaller eating episodes throughout active daylight hours supplemented by one larger shared meal in the evening, and genuine variation in total daily eating frequency depending directly on recent hunting and foraging success. This pattern shows up across multiple, geographically distinct hunter-gatherer societies, studied by different researchers, which lends real, meaningful support to the idea that this kind of flexible, opportunity-driven eating pattern likely characterized ancient human behavior across an enormous stretch of our species' history, not just in one specific isolated region or time period. Now let's talk about something genuinely important regarding children specifically, because their eating patterns almost certainly looked meaningfully different from adult patterns in ways worth addressing directly. Young children with smaller stomach capacity and higher relative energy needs to support rapid growth and development almost certainly needed more frequent eating episodes throughout the day compared to adults, even within the same generally opportunistic food availability-driven ancient eating culture. This means ancient mothers and other caregivers likely prioritized more frequent, smaller feeding opportunities specifically for young children whenever possible, even during leaner stretches when adults might be managing with less frequent, more spaced-out eating. Breastfeeding itself, of course, represented an almost continuously available food source for infants specifically, completely separate from the broader group's hunting and foraging success, meaning the very youngest ancient humans likely experienced considerably more consistent, frequent feeding than older children or adults navigating the full unpredictability of ancient food supply. Let's talk about something genuinely fascinating regarding seasonal variation in meal frequency, because this connects directly to broader patterns we've discussed in previous videos about seasonal abundance and scarcity cycles. During particularly abundant seasons, late summer and autumn in many ancient environments, when fruits ripened, nuts dropped, and animals fattened up ahead of winter, ancient humans likely experienced not just more food overall, but genuinely more frequent eating episodes throughout the day, simply because there was more readily available food to encounter and consume during active foraging hours. Conversely, during harsh winter months or difficult early spring stretches before new growth really took hold, both the total amount of food available and the frequency of actual eating episodes throughout the day likely dropped significantly, sometimes dramatically. This means an ancient human's typical how many meals a day answer would have looked genuinely different depending on exactly which month you happened to be asking about, adding yet another layer of variation to a question that already resists any single, fixed numerical answer. Let's address something genuinely important regarding the social dimension of meal frequency too, because we've covered extensively in previous videos how status and social standing affected access to food more broadly, and that pattern almost certainly extended to meal frequency specifically as well. In groups with any meaningful social hierarchy, higher status individuals, successful hunters, respected elders, or people with strong social connections may have had access to more frequent eating opportunities compared to lower status group members, who might have had to wait longer between substantial meals or rely more heavily on whatever scraps and lower quality food remained after higher status members had already eaten their share. This isn't a universal pattern across every single ancient group, since plenty of ancient social structures were genuinely quite egalitarian about food distribution, as we've discussed in earlier videos covering ancient social dynamics. But where meaningful hierarchy existed, meal frequency itself, not just total food quantity, likely reflected those underlying social dynamics in genuinely meaningful ways. Now here's a detail that deserves real attention, because it's almost comically relatable. Ancient humans almost certainly experienced something very close to what we'd now call hanger, that irritable, short-tempered mood that creeps in when you've gone too long without eating. Blood sugar regulation and the psychological effects of hunger aren't modern phenomena invented alongside processed snack food and office vending machines. They're deeply rooted biological responses that almost certainly affected ancient humans navigating genuinely long, unpredictable gaps between meals just as much, if not more, than they affect modern people who skip lunch because of a busy schedule. It's entirely reasonable to imagine ancient group dynamics being directly shaped by collective hunger and irritability during particularly lean stretches, with patience wearing thin, tempers running a little shorter, and overall group mood improving dramatically the moment a successful hunt or productive foraging session finally brought in a substantial meal. The relief of that first big bite after a genuinely hungry stretch was almost certainly one of the most viscerally satisfying experiences in ancient daily life, probably more intensely felt and more deeply appreciated than most modern meals ever managed to be, precisely because the contrast between hunger and satisfaction was so much sharper and so much less predictable. Let's talk about something genuinely important regarding portion size, too, because meal frequency and portion size are deeply interconnected in ways that matter for fully understanding ancient eating patterns. Given the irregular, unpredictable nature of ancient food availability, there's a strong biological and practical logic suggesting ancient humans likely ate considerably larger portions when food was actually available, compared to the more modest, consistently sized portions typical of regular modern meals eaten multiple times daily without much variation. If you don't know when your next substantial meal is coming, eating as much as reasonably possible during the meals you do get access to makes genuine survival sense. Maximizing the energy and nutrients absorbed during each actual eating opportunity rather than pacing intake evenly across a day that might not actually provide multiple opportunities at all. This pattern of eating in larger, less frequent bursts rather than smaller, more frequent, evenly distributed meals represents a genuinely different relationship with food than most modern eating culture promotes, and it's worth recognizing that this difference comes from a completely different underlying food environment, not from ancient humans simply having worse self-control or less refined eating habits than modern people. Let's bring in one more genuinely interesting wrinkle here regarding meat specifically, because we've discussed extensively in previous videos how caloric-dense, fat-rich meat from successful hunts represented some of the most significant feast opportunities in ancient human life. Following a successful large game hunt, there was often genuine social and practical pressure to consume meat relatively quickly before spoilage set in, which meant feast periods following successful hunts likely involved not just larger portions, but genuinely compressed, intensive eating schedules, multiple substantial meat-heavy meals across a short window of days, sometimes including middle-of-the-night eating if a hunt happened to conclude in the evening, and fresh meat needed processing and at least partial consumption before serious spoilage became a concern. This kind of intensive, compressed feasting following a successful hunt represents one of the more extreme, dramatic examples of how flexible and circumstance-driven ancient meal frequency actually was, completely unlike the steady, predictable 3 times daily rhythm most modern people take for granted. So how many meals did ancient humans actually eat in a day? Based on everything we've covered here, feast and famine cycles, continuous low-level foraging and snacking throughout active hours, shared evening meals as the closest thing to a consistent daily ritual, morning food scarcity due to the practical sequencing of hunting before eating, seasonal variation in both food abundance and meal frequency, and significant individual variation based on age, status, and social access. The honest, complete answer is that there simply wasn't a fixed number at all. Ancient humans might eat once, eat a dozen small times, or eat almost continuously throughout an abundant day, depending entirely on what the environment happened to be offering at that exact moment. The whole concept of counting discrete meals, the way modern culture insists on doing, barely applies to a lifestyle built around continuous opportunity, unpredictable abundance, and inevitable scarcity, cycling through each other in a rhythm that had absolutely nothing to do with clocks, schedules, or any fixed cultural expectation about when eating was supposed to happen. And maybe that's genuinely the most interesting takeaway buried in all of this. The rigid 3 meals a day structure so many people today treat as an unquestionable biological default isn't ancient at all. It's a relatively recent cultural invention shaped by agricultural schedules, industrial work hours, and historical habit, layered on top of a digestive system and metabolic framework that actually evolved across an enormous stretch of time built around feast, famine, continuous grazing, and deeply unpredictable food availability. Your body, biologically speaking, probably has considerably more flexibility around eating timing than modern meal culture generally assumes, precisely because that flexibility was an absolutely essential survival trait for an enormous stretch of human history when reliable, scheduled food simply wasn't something anyone could ever count on. So the next time you're stressing about missing lunch or eating dinner a little later than usual, just remember that somewhere back across hundreds of thousands of years of ancient human history, an entire species survived, thrived, and eventually built everything we now call civilization, while operating on an eating schedule that would look, by modern standards, like complete and total chaos. No fixed meal times, no consistent portion sizes, no predictable rhythm whatsoever, just hunger, opportunity, and whatever the environment happened to be generous enough to provide on any given day.